They called her incompetent. They stripped her badge in front of the entire floor and had security drag her toward the exit while physicians laughed behind her back. Emily Carter, 28 years old, 5'4", a nurse nobody wanted to defend, shoved out of Stonebridge Medical Center like she was nothing. But as security's hands gripped her arms and the glass doors swung open, something happened that nobody in that hospital was prepared for. A convoy of military vehicles came screaming into the parking lot, armored, fast, and carrying men who were bleeding out. The lead commander walked through those doors, took one look at the woman being thrown out, and stopped cold. "Stand down. That's Sergeant Emily Carter. If this story has you hooked already, follow me so you don't miss what happens next. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels." The morning started the way most bad mornings do, quietly, with no warning that anything was about to fall apart. Emily Carter arrived at Stonebridge Medical Center at 6:45, 15 minutes before her shift technically began. She always did. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, not because she needed the overtime logged. She did it because the night crew at Stonebridge ran lean, and there was usually something waiting, a patient who hadn't been repositioned, a medication timing that had slipped, a family member sitting alone in the hallway because no one had thought to update them. Emily noticed those things. She had trained herself to notice them in environments where missing a detail got someone killed, and that habit did not turn off just because she was now wearing scrubs instead of body armor. She badged through the staff entrance, nodded to Dale at the security desk, and walked straight to the ER locker room to drop her bag. The hospital smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The linoleum floor had a crack running from the nurses' station down toward Bay 4 that the maintenance department had been promising to fix for 6 weeks. Stonebridge Medical Center was not a bad hospital. It was a mid-sized regional facility in West Haven, the kind of place that handled everything from car accident trauma to pediatric cases to elderly patients with nowhere else to go. It had decent equipment, a reasonably talented surgical staff, and one very serious problem: Richard Lawson. Lawson was the chief administrator. He had held the position for 9 years, and in that time he had built the kind of institutional authority that made people nervous to challenge him even when they knew he was wrong. He was tall, well-dressed, precise in his speech, and completely intolerant of anyone whose presence made him look less essential. He had a gift for identifying threats to his position and neutralizing them before they became visible to anyone above him. And for reasons Emily had not fully understood when she first started working at Stonebridge 8 months ago, she had landed directly in his crosshairs. She did not know it yet, but today was the day he planned to finish it. Emily pulled on her badge lanyard and walked out to the floor. The overnight nurse, Priya, gave her a grateful look and started the handoff summary. 4 patients in active monitoring, 1 post-op hip replacement in room 6, who was running a mild fever. A teenager in Bay 2 with a respiratory infection that kept spiking. An elderly man in room 9 who had been brought in by his daughter at 3 in the morning, confused and combative, who Priya suspected was in the early stages of septic shock, but whose blood work hadn't come back yet. "Room 9 is the one to watch," Priya said, voice low. "His daughter has been asking for updates every 20 minutes. Dr. Halverston was supposed to check in at 5, but he didn't come down." Emily nodded. "I'll go see him first." The man in room 9 was named Walter Briggs. He was 71, with a medical history that included type 2 diabetes, a prior stroke, and a heart valve repair from 4 years ago. He was awake when Emily came in, but not fully present. His eyes tracked her without recognition. His skin was warm and slightly clammy. His daughter, a woman in her mid-40s named Sandra, stood up from the chair in the corner the moment Emily walked through the door. "He was fine 2 days ago," Sandra said. Her voice had the tight, controlled quality of someone who had been crying earlier and was determined not to do it again. "He was home, he was eating, he was watching TV, and then yesterday afternoon he just stopped making sense." "When did the confusion start?" "Around 2 in the afternoon. He kept asking where my mother was. My mother died in 2019. Emily checked his IV line, pulled up the monitoring data on the bedside tablet, looked at his last set of vitals. Heart rate elevated. blood pressure dropping from the overnight reading, respiratory rate climbing. She pressed 2 fingers gently to his wrist and counted. Has anyone mentioned the possibility of infection to you? The night doctor said they were waiting on labs. Labs should be back by now. Emily looked at the tablet again and saw that they were, but no one had flagged them. She read the values twice. Elevated white cell count, lactate trending up, CRP through the floor. She walked out to the station, pulled up the attending physician schedule, and found that Dr. Halverston had not in fact checked in. He was listed as on floor, but his last documented patient contact was from 11 the night before. She paged him. While she waited, she went back to Mr. Briggs, adjusted his IV rate, checked his catheter output, and documented the sepsis indicators in his chart. When Halverston didn't respond to the page within 8 minutes, she paged him again and simultaneously sent a flag through the hospital's internal alert system to the charge physician on duty. The charge physician was Dr. Marcus Foulds. He was 43, competent in a narrow and procedural way, and deeply loyal to Lawson. He came down to the station 12 minutes later, looked at Emily's documentation, and frowned. Why are you flagging this as sepsis protocol? Because it meets the criteria: 2 SIRS indicators, a suspected source, and lactate over 2. His temperature is only 38.1. His blood pressure has dropped 4 points since the last reading, and his output is low. Temperature is one indicator. It's not the only one. Foulds looked at her the way some of the physicians at Stonebridge had been looking at her for months, like she was a nurse who had forgotten what nurses were supposed to do. I'll review the chart, he said. You manage your patients. I am managing my patient? He walked away. Emily stood at the station for a moment, jaw tight. Then she went back to work. She spent the next 40 minutes moving between her 4 assigned patients, documenting everything carefully, checking in on Sandra Briggs twice more, adjusting the teenager's respiratory treatment when his oxygen saturation dropped briefly. Around 8:15, she heard raised voices near the administrative wing and recognized one of them as Lawson's. She didn't think much of it. Lawson was always loud about something. It was not until 8:42 that she understood the voices had been about her. She was at the medication cart when she heard her name. Not quietly, loudly, from the direction of the nurses' station, where Richard Lawson was standing with Foulds and 2 members of the hospital's patient relations team. Lawson was in a full suit at 8 in the morning, which was typical. What was not typical was the way the floor had gone quiet around him, nurses and orderlies finding reasons to look at their charts or their phones. Carter. His voice was flat. Not angry. That would have suggested she mattered enough to make him angry. Flat in the way that indicated a decision had already been made. In my office. Now. She walked with him because there was nothing else to do. His office was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the main entrance. It was a large room that he had furnished to signal authority. Framed credentials on the wall, a desk that was too big for the space, chairs on the visitor side that were intentionally slightly lower than his own. Emily had been in this room twice before. Both times had been uncomfortable. This time felt different. Foulds came in behind them. So did a woman from HR named Tanya Gill, who would not meet Emily's eyes when she sat down. Lawson stood behind his desk and did not invite anyone to sit. I'm going to be direct, he said. We've received multiple complaints about your conduct on the floor. Overstepping your scope of practice, interfering with physician decisions, disrupting the chain of command. Emily looked at him steadily. Who filed the complaints? That's not information I'm required to share at this stage. I flagged a patient this morning who I believe is developing sepsis. That's within my scope. That's exactly what I'm supposed to do. You contradicted Dr. Foulds' assessment. I documented my clinical observations. If Dr. Foulds disagrees, he can document his reasoning. Foulds shifted in his chair. He didn't say anything. Emily. Lawson opened a folder on his desk. She could see her employment file from across the room. This isn't the first time we've had concerns about your attitude toward the medical staff. You have a pattern of overconfidence, of behaving as though your judgment supersedes the physicians on this floor. I've never overridden a physician's order. You've questioned them, repeatedly. in front of patients and staff. I've raised concerns through appropriate channels. In 9 years, I have never had this level of friction from a nursing staff member. He said it like it was her fault, like she had imported the friction from somewhere else and spread it through his clean, well-run hospital. I've spoken with the Chief of Medicine and the Patient Relations Board. We're terminating your employment, effective immediately. You'll surrender your badge and your access credentials, and security will escort you out. The room was very quiet. Emily looked at Tanya Gill, who was staring at the notepad in her hands. She looked at Foulds, who had developed a sudden interest in the window. She looked back at Lawson. Walter Briggs in room 9 is showing early indicators of septic shock. Someone needs to watch his lactate levels and adjust his fluids. That will be handled by the medical team. I want that documented. I want it on the record that I raised it before I left. Your documentation has been noted. Lawson nodded to Foulds, who stood. Please surrender your badge. She unpinned it from her lanyard, set it on the desk, did not throw it, did not say anything else. She stood, and she walked out. And she did not look back at Richard Lawson because she understood on some level that looking back at him would give him something she was not willing to give. The walk through the hospital floor was the worst part, not because she broke down. She didn't, but because she could feel the eyes. The nurses at the station who had been her colleagues for 8 months, some of whom had covered her breaks and shared lunches with her in the break room, were watching with that specific kind of pity that comes when someone is in trouble and everyone else is grateful it isn't them. A couple of them looked genuinely sorry. Most looked away. The residents near Bay 3 went very still as she passed. 2 security officers flanked her. Not touching her, not yet, but close enough that the message was clear to everyone watching. She kept her shoulders straight. She kept her pace even. She had walked through harder things than this, in harder places than a hospital corridor, and she had learned a long time ago that the way you carry yourself in the worst moment is what people remember. She was 20 feet from the main entrance when she heard it, the sound of engines, multiple, heavy, moving fast. It registered before she consciously processed it, that particular pitch, that particular volume, not civilian vehicles. Through the glass doors, she could see the parking lot. 3 black SUVs and a military transport vehicle had cut across the lanes at speed and were pulling directly up to the emergency entrance. Not the main entrance, the ER bay, 40 feet to her left. Doors were already opening before the vehicles fully stopped. The security officer on her left said, "What the?" and then stopped talking because what came through the ER doors was not something Stonebridge Medical Center was equipped to process. 4 men. 2 of them mobile, 2 of them being carried. All 4 in tactical gear, stripped of identifying insignia, but the equipment was unmistakable if you knew what you were looking at. One of the mobile ones had his arm wrapped in a field dressing that had soaked through completely. The other was moving under his own power, but wrong. His gait was off, his left leg taking weight badly, and the expression on his face was the specific kind of controlled that people used when they were managing serious pain and had decided not to stop moving because stopping meant dying. Behind them came the 5th man. He was taller than the others, older. He moved the way certain men moved when they were in command. Not rushing, not performing, just moving with the kind of certainty that created space. He was in civilian clothes, but his bearing was unmistakably military. His eyes swept the ER in a single practice scan and landed almost immediately on Emily. She had stopped walking. The security officers on either side of her had also stopped because the situation had very suddenly expanded beyond whatever they had been trained to handle. The ER nursing staff was already responding, calling for trauma teams, clearing bay space, reaching for crash carts. Dr. Foulds, who had followed at a distance to watch Emily's exit, appeared at the edge of the hallway with a look on his face that had rapidly cycled from satisfaction to confusion to something approaching alarm. The 5th man walked directly toward Emily, not toward the nurse's station, not toward the triage desk, toward her. He stopped when he was close enough to speak at a normal volume, which in the sudden chaos of the ER meant he was very close. "Sergeant Carter." His voice was level, not a question. Emily looked at him. She had last seen Colonel James Ardell 3 years ago, in a different country, in circumstances that she did not discuss with anyone in her civilian life. He was thinner now, or maybe she was remembering him wrong. The lines around his eyes were deeper. Colonel, I have 4 operators, 2 critical, 1 probable tension pneumo, 1 femoral bleed that's been packed for, he checked his watch, 47 minutes, another with blast concussion and pupil asymmetry. 4th is walking, but his calf is open down to the fascia, and he is not going to be walking much longer. Behind him, someone dropped something metallic, and the sound cracked through the ER. Emily turned to look at the 2 security officers who had been escorting her. Then she turned to look at the ER entrance, where the injured men were being laid out on gurneys by their teammates, and where the hospital's trauma staff was converging in a way that looked organized but wasn't. Too many people asking questions at once, nobody with a clear picture of what they were actually dealing with. She turned back to Ardell. "I just got terminated," she said. "I know." He said it without breaking stride. "I'll deal with that." He turned toward the crowd, and his voice shifted register, not loud, but carrying, the kind of projection that came from years of being heard in loud places. "Listen up. This woman is taking command of this trauma room. Anyone who has a problem with that answers to me. Move." Nobody moved immediately. The ER staff looked at each other. Dr. Foulds, who had arrived at the edge of the bay, started to say something. She's been... I said move." Ardell didn't raise his voice, didn't have to. Emily was already walking. She pushed past the paralyzed cluster of residents at the gurney nearest the door and looked at the man on it. Mid-30s, built like a cornerstone, currently the color of old paper. The field dressing on his thigh was beyond saturated. She pulled on gloves from the cart that an ER tech had wheeled up. The tech, a young man named Oscar, who she had worked alongside dozens of times, met her eyes and nodded without asking questions. "I need a surgical tray, type and cross on all 4, 2 large-bore IVs on this one right now. Call the OR and tell them we're coming up in under 10 minutes, she said. Not loud, not performing authority, just saying what needed to happen in the order it needed to happen. "And somebody get me the pupil asymmetry patient's GCS. Oscar was already moving. One of the ER nurses, Maria, who had watched Emily's walk of shame across the floor 20 minutes ago, snapped into motion beside her without a word, pulling supplies, relaying orders to the desk. Across the bay, she could hear one of the soldiers giving a terse situation report to a second nurse, using terminology that the nurse was struggling to follow. Emily glanced over. "Mechanism," she said sharply, not stopping what she was doing. IED, partial structure collapse. 3 of them were inside, 2 were on perimeter. Time since injury, approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes. She ran the math without thinking about it. Whatever volume these men had started with, they had been losing it for an hour and a half. The packing had bought time, not much more. "We need a second surgical team," she said to the room. "Not a consult, a second team standing by ready to go." "We only have 1 OR prepped at this hour," someone said. She didn't know who. "Then prep a second one." "That takes time. So does dying. Which one do you want to prevent?" Silence. Then movement. The right kind. Richard Lawson appeared at the edge of the ER bay. He was still in his suit. He looked at the controlled chaos of the trauma room, at the soldiers on the gurneys, at Emily standing at the center of it, giving directions that people were following. His expression went through several things in rapid succession before settling on something cold and hard. "What is she doing here, Sas?" he said, to no one in particular. "She has been terminated. She doesn't have credentials to..." Colonel Ardell turned from where he had been standing near the secondary gurney. "Mr. Lawson." He had clearly obtained the name in the last 2 minutes from someone. "I suggest you step back. This is my hospital. I don't know who you are, but I'm the person whose men are on those tables." Ardell's voice was quiet in a way that was more threatening than loud. "And right now, the only person in this building I trust to keep them alive is the woman you just threw out the door. So unless you have something useful to contribute, I'm asking you to step back and let her work." Lawson did not step back, but he also did not speak again. Emily did not watch the exchange. She had already moved to the third gurney, where the soldier with pupil asymmetry was lying still with his eyes half open, and she was assessing his airway, her hands moving with a kind of efficiency that had nothing theatrical about it. She had done this in the dark, in the rain, with incoming fire 60 meters away. She had done it with no equipment at all except what she had carried in a pack. The ceiling lights at Stonebridge were very bright. The equipment was good. There were people around her who knew what they were doing, even if they didn't know what they were dealing with. She could work with this. The monitor beside her beeped 3 times in rapid succession, and she looked up at the numbers and felt something tighten in her chest. Not panic, something more useful than panic. The femoral bleed patient's pressure had just dropped below the threshold. "I need a vascular surgeon in this bay in the next 4 minutes," she said. "Dr. Kellerman is in a scheduled procedure." "Then pull him out of it." Oscar picked up the phone. Across the room, she could hear Lawson saying something to Fools, his voice low and furious. She caught fragments, liability and credentials and board. She filed them away and kept working, because there were 4 men who had been willing to bleed in places where most people would never go, and they were here, and she was here, and the only thing that mattered right now was the next 2 minutes. The monitor screamed. Emily moved. She got to him in 4 steps. The monitor was screaming because his pressure had bottomed, systolic down to 61, which meant the packing on his thigh had either shifted or was no longer enough. And 61 meant the edge of the cliff, meant the next 30 seconds mattered more than the next 30 minutes. Emily's hands were already moving when she reached the gurney. She didn't call out for help. She looked at Oscar, who was already there, and at Maria, who had read the monitor from across the room and was coming with a second IV kit, and she said one word. "Tourniquet." Maria handed it over without fumbling. Emily applied it 6 centimeters above the existing field dressing, tightened it until the resistance told her it was seated, noted the time on the clock above the bay, 9:04, and then said to Oscar, "Get me Kellerman, not a message. Put him on the phone." "I'm trying. Try harder." The soldier on the gurney, she still didn't have his name, hadn't had time to check the chart that didn't exist yet, opened his eyes. They were brown, slightly unfocused, but there. He looked at her the way people looked at someone when they were deciding whether to trust them with something they couldn't afford to lose. "You're going to be okay," she said, because it was the thing that needed to be said, and because she had seen men pull back from worse than this when someone said it directly and meant it. She wasn't sure yet if she meant it. She thought she probably did. He closed his eyes again. Dr. Kellerman arrived 90 seconds later. He was still in his OR cap, his mask pulled down around his chin, visibly annoyed at being pulled from a procedure. The annoyance lasted about 4 seconds after he looked at the monitor and the tourniquet and the field dressing beneath it. "How long has that packing been in?" 52 minutes from injury time, Emily said. "He's been hypotensive for the last 3. Pressure's coming up slightly since the tourniquet, but he needs the OR." Kellerman was already gloved. He looked at the wound, looked at the vitals, looked at Emily. "You put this tourniquet in?" "Yes." He nodded once, not approval, exactly, more like adjustment, recalibrating something. And then he was talking to the OR desk, and the conversation shifted out of Emily's hands, which was exactly what was supposed to happen. She stepped back and moved to the next gurney. The soldier with pupil asymmetry, his name, she'd learned from the medic who had ridden with them, was Sergeant First Class Derek Yunt, was not unconscious, but was not fully present either. GCS of 12. Right pupil responding sluggishly, left pupil blown. She had already called for a CT, which was being set up, but the question she was working through was whether they had time for a CT, or whether the pressure in his skull was building fast enough that waiting 20 minutes for imaging was a gamble she couldn't justify. She asked the medic, a compact, precise woman named Torres, who had been maintaining Yunt's airway since they came through the door, "Any posturing, any Cushing response in transit?" Bradycardia started about 15 minutes out. BP was climbing. Cushing's triad. Bradycardia, rising blood pressure, irregular breathing, the brain herniating. She looked at Yunt's chest. His breathing was not irregular yet, but it was slower than it should be. "Cancel the CT," she said to the desk. "I need neurosurgery now, not in 20 minutes. Now." The desk called. She stood at Yunt's side and watched his breathing and talked to him quietly. Not about anything meaningful, just the kind of steady, low-level conversation that kept a brain engaged, kept it working, reminded it that there was a reason to keep the body running. She had done this in a forward operating base with no electricity and no backup coming, just her voice and her hands in the dark. At some point, she became aware that Lawson was still at the edge of the bay. She became aware of it because he spoke. "This has gone far enough." His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not fear exactly, more like a structure starting to flex under load. "Whatever Colonel, whoever you are, whatever arrangement you think you've made, this woman does not have hospital privileges. She is not authorized to perform. She's not performing surgery," Ardell said from somewhere to Emily's left. "She's triaging, coordinating, which is what a combat medic with 8 years of field experience does. She is a nurse with a terminated employment contract. If something goes wrong with one of these men, Stonebridge is not liable. I'm not worried about liability right now." A pause. "Are you?" Lawson didn't answer that. Emily kept her attention on Yunt and did not look up. But she heard it. She heard the specific quality of silence that followed Ardell's question, the kind of silence that meant something had landed that could not be unlandled. And she filed it, the way she filed things that mattered, and kept working. The neurosurgeon on call was a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who arrived in the ER bay 6 minutes after being paged. She was in her 50s, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she moved quickly without appearing to rush. She looked at Yunt's pupils, looked at his respiration, looked at Emily. "You're the one who called?" "Yes." "Based on?" "Bradycardia in transit. Blown pupil. GCS dropping." The medic confirmed Cushing response onset approximately 15 minutes from hospital arrival. Osei looked at Torres, who nodded. Then Osei looked back at Emily for a moment longer than felt neutral. "Who are you?" she asked. Not rudely, just a question. "Emily Carter. I was ER nursing staff until about 40 minutes ago." Something moved in Osei's expression that Emily couldn't quite read. The surgeon nodded and turned to the desk. "Get me OR2. And someone get this man a head ultrasound on the way up. I'm not waiting for CT." She was already moving. Yunt's gurney went with her. The bay had not calmed down. 3 separate sets of monitors were beeping at different intervals. The soldier with the arm wound, his name was Reyes, she'd gotten a chart now, thin as it was, had been stabilized and was sitting upright on a gurney, ignoring the nurse trying to take his blood pressure so he could watch what was happening around him. The 4th soldier, the one who had been walking when he came in, had been sat down by Oscar against his considerable objections and was now being assessed for the leg wound that had opened down to the fascia. His name, according to the medic, was Cahill. He was 26 years old, and he kept saying he was fine. "You're not fine," Emily told him when she got to him. She looked at the wound. It was bad, not immediately life-threatening the way the others were, but the kind of wound that looked manageable right up until the moment it didn't. "How long has this been open?" "Hour and a half, give or take." "Did you walk on it the whole time?" "Had to." She looked up at him. He had the specifically exhausted face of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 90 minutes and could feel it starting to drain. There was a smear of someone else's blood on his jaw that he either hadn't noticed or had noticed and decided wasn't relevant. "You need a vascular consult and probably debridement," she said. "You should sit still. The others are being handled. You don't need to manage this. Sit still." He sat still. It seemed to cost him something. Maria appeared at Emily's shoulder. "Kellerman's in the OR with the femoral. Osei took Yunt up. Reyes is stable, waiting on surgical consult for the arm. What do you need?" Emily looked at the bay, at the remaining soldier with the arm wound, now compliant with monitoring. At Cahill, sitting with his jaw tight. At Oscar managing the desk. At Torres, the military medic, who had sat down in the corner of the bay and was watching everything with the blank focus of someone who had been awake for a very long time and was running on professional obligation. "Get Torres some water," Emily said, "and get a plastics consult for Cahill." Maria went. The crisis did not end then, because crises didn't end cleanly. They subsided, they shifted, they handed off their urgency to the next thing. The next hour and 40 minutes were the kind of work that didn't feel dramatic from the outside. Constant monitoring, communicating with the OR teams, managing Cahill's wound with the plastics resident who came down, keeping the documentation running because someone had to, and the ER staff was stretched. Emily moved between tasks without wasting motion, without the kind of performed calm that people put on when they were scared. She was tired. She had not eaten since 5 that morning. At one point, she knocked a tray of supplies off a cart because she turned too fast, and she said something under her breath that she would not have said in polite company. Nobody commented on it. At some point, Ardell appeared beside her and said quietly, "Kellerman is out of the OR," said the repair held. "His pressure is stable." Emily exhaled, slow. She had not fully realized she was holding something until she put it down. "Yunt?" "Still in. Ose says she's managing the bleed. No word yet." "Okay." "You should eat something." She looked at him. "Are you giving me orders, Colonel?" "Suggesting. I'll eat when Yunt is out." He didn't argue with that. He went back to his position near the bay entrance, where he had been standing with a posture that Emily recognized. The specific stillness of a commanding officer waiting for news he couldn't control and had trained himself not to fight. Richard Lawson had not left. She had been peripherally aware of him the whole time, the way you were aware of a sound in the wall, not directly threatening but present, with a quality to it that made the back of your neck notice. He was in the hallway outside the bay now, on his phone. He had been on his phone for 30 minutes. Whatever calls he was making them with the focused intensity of someone constructing a defense. Fouls was with him. They had spoken 3 times that she'd observed, briefly and close together, the way people spoke when they were aligning a story. Emily documented everything in real time. Not because she was expecting a fight, or not only because of that, but because it was what you did. You documented. You kept the record clean and complete. She had learned that in the Army, where the paperwork that seemed bureaucratic and pointless had a way of becoming the only thing standing between you and someone else's version of events. The shift supervisor, a nurse named Grace, who had worked at Stonebridge for 11 years, came to stand near Emily around 11 o'clock. Grace was in her early 50s with a flat, assessing face and the kind of deep institutional knowledge that came from a decade of watching the same patterns repeat. "You should know," Grace said, her voice barely above a murmur. "Lawson is talking to the board. He's trying to get a formal statement from them that you were acting without authorization." "He's probably right that I was, technically." Grace looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. "You're not worried about that?" "I'm worried about a man whose brain was being compressed by an expanding hematoma. Lawson can do what he's going to do." Emily finished what she was charting and looked up. "Were there complaints?" "Before today." "Formal ones, in my file." Grace was quiet for a moment. "There were notes, flagged by fools mostly, a couple from other attendings." "How many of them do you think were legitimate?" Another pause. Longer. "Emily, I've been on this floor for 11 years. I've seen Lawson build a file on someone before. It's a specific thing he does. Very careful, very documented, very—" She stopped. "I should have said something sooner." "You're saying something now." Grace nodded once and walked back to the station. The board notification came at 11:23. Tanya Gill from HR delivered it personally. A letter, printed on official Stonebridge letterhead confirming Emily's termination and noting that her actions since the termination order had taken effect constituted unauthorized medical practice and would be referred to the state licensing board. Tanya handed it to her with the look of a person doing a thing they knew was wrong and had decided not to think about too hard. Emily read it, folded it, put it in her scrub pocket. "Tell Mr. Lawson I received it," she said. Tanya walked away quickly. Ardell had seen the exchange from across the bay. He came over and she handed him the letter without comment. He read it, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, but in the specific way that certain faces changed when a decision crystallized. "This is going to be a problem for him," he said. "He doesn't seem to think so. He doesn't know what I know yet." He folded the letter and handed it back. "There's a reason my team came to this hospital specifically, and it wasn't the closest option." She looked at him. "You came here because of me?" "We came here because someone who runs a medical intake program for special operations veterans reviewed the duty rosters at regional hospitals within 40 minutes of our position and flagged the name." He said it plainly, without drama. Your name. I didn't know I was flagged. We keep track of our people, even the ones who left. Emily said nothing for a moment. She was aware of several things at once: the low-level noise of the ER, the monitors, Maria's voice on the phone somewhere across the bay, the weight of the folded letter in her pocket, and something else, something she didn't have a clean word for, that had to do with 8 months of being looked at like she was less than she was, and this moment of being told that somewhere, in a system she had left, she had never stopped being counted. She looked away. I need to check on Cahill. Cahill was in Bay 2 with the plastics resident, who had been thorough and was now explaining the wound closure options with the careful detail of someone who had been trained to communicate clearly with patients and was not accounting for the fact that his current patient had probably stitched himself up in the field at least once. Cahill was tolerating the explanation with the patience of a man who understood he had to sit through it. How is it? Emily asked the resident. Manageable. He's going to need 2 layers of closure and antibiotics, and he should not have been walking on it for 90 minutes. I know, Cahill said. I've been told. Emily checked the vitals on the chart. Better than they had been. His color was improved, which was the kind of data point that didn't show up in numbers but mattered. She looked at him. Did you eat anything today? He blinked. Before the mission. I'll have someone bring you something. You really don't have to. I know I don't have to. She was already turning. You need calories. Stop being difficult. She heard him make a sound that might have been a laugh. Abbreviated, surprised, like he hadn't expected to make it. The news about Yunt came at 12:17. Ose came down from the OR, still in her surgical gown, which she had not done because she had to. She could have sent a resident, but which she did anyway, and Emily understood without being told that this was a courtesy and also something else, some acknowledgement of what had happened in the bay that morning. Ose found Emily at the station and said, He's stable. The bleed was venous, not arterial. Unusual presentation given the impact, but it held once we relieved the pressure. His neurostatus should be clearer in the next 6 to 8 hours. Emily nodded. She felt the thing in her chest that had been tight since 9:04 release by about half. You made the right call on the CT, Ose said. If we'd waited for imaging, he would have been in much worse shape. The medic flagged the Cushing response. I just acted on it. Ose looked at her steadily. That's not actually what I'm describing. Emily didn't answer. Ose left. Emily sat down for the first time in 4 hours, on the edge of a chair at the nurse's station, and the physical reality of the morning arrived all at once. The ache in her lower back, the dryness in her throat, the faint tremble in her hands that she recognized as blood sugar and not emotion, though the distinction felt thin. Grace set a protein bar on the desk next to her without saying anything. Emily picked it up and ate half of it and stared at the station wall, where someone had taped a cartoon of a cat hanging from a branch that said, Hang in there, in a font that had been cheerful in 1987 and now just looked resigned. Across the floor, Lawson's office light was on. Through the glass wall of the mezzanine, she could see him standing at his desk, still on the phone, still building whatever he was building. Ardell sat down in the chair beside her. He did not bring anything with him, no paperwork, no phone. He sat the way soldiers sat when they were between things, fully at rest without being relaxed, as if the state of rest was something you occupied on purpose. Your discharge paperwork, he said. From the Army. You left after the Cairo Valley mission. She looked at the wall. That's a matter of record. The official record says you requested voluntary discharge, standard ETS, honorable. That's what it says. Emily. His voice was careful, not gentle. Ardell was not a gentle man, but precise. The way you were precise with something that needed to not be broken. I know that's not the whole story. I knew it then. I should have pushed harder. She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the wall, not performing guilt. He was too old and too contained for that. Just acknowledging it, the way you acknowledge something that couldn't be changed but shouldn't be lied about either. It was a long time ago, she said. Not that long. She didn't answer. There's something you need to know, he said. When we were routed to this location, when your name came up, I ran a standard clearance check. Cross-reference of current civilian placement against prior service records. Standard procedure. He paused. Your file triggered a secondary review. Why? Because there's a discrepancy. He turned to look at her now. The formal record of your voluntary discharge includes a performance notation filed 3 months before your ETS date. It flags an incident during the Kyra Valley operation. Medical decision under fire. Allegation of protocol deviation. Emily said nothing. That notation did not exist when your discharge was processed. I reviewed your file personally before you left. It wasn't there. The ER noise continued around them. A monitor beeped somewhere. Someone across the floor called for a wheelchair. The ordinary machinery of the hospital going about its business, indifferent to what was being said in this chair at this desk. Someone added it, she said. That's what the secondary review suggests. She looked back at the wall. The cat was still hanging from its branch, still being told to hang in there. When was the notation dated? Retroactively. Dated to 11 days before your ETS, but the metadata in the digital file shows it was created 14 months after you were discharged. He said it flat, without editorializing, but the weight of it was in the room, which means someone, after the fact, altered a federal military record to include a negative performance notation in the file of a discharged veteran. Why? Ardell's jaw moved just slightly, the motion of someone choosing their next words with care. That's what the people I've been on the phone with for the last 2 hours are trying to determine. He looked at her. Emily, how did you end up at Stonebridge? She thought about it. Recruiter called, said they were looking for experienced ER nurses, that they'd seen my background, that it was a good position. I needed work. I took it. Who made the call? She thought harder. A placement agency. A name she had not spent much time thinking about. Meridian Health Staffing, standard placement firm. Ardell took out his phone and typed something. Why? She asked again. Because Richard Lawson's brother-in-law runs a company called Meridian Health Staffing, he said. And because someone made a phone call 3 months ago to a contact in Army personnel records. And because when I run the metadata on that file alteration, I want to know if the signature trail leads somewhere specific. The room got very quiet around Emily. Not actually quiet. It was a hospital ER. There was no actual quiet. But quiet in the way that happened when the noise stopped mattering because the inside of your head was louder. He set me up, she said. Not a question. I think he found you, Ardell said, which is different and also worse. Someone with a reason to want your military record compromised used civilian channels to identify where you were, place you in a hospital he controlled, and then systematically build a case for your professional removal. He put the phone away. What I don't know yet is why. Why you specifically. What you know, or what you represent, that made you worth that kind of effort. Emily sat with that for a moment. Through the mezzanine window, Lawson's silhouette moved behind the glass. Still on the phone. Still talking. She thought about Walter Briggs in room 9, who had been showing early sepsis indicators this morning and whose treatment she had flagged before she was dragged out of the building. She had not been back to check on him. She did not know if anyone else had. She stood. I need to check on a patient, she said. Emily, 2 minutes. She walked to the internal phone at the station and called room 9. It rang 4 times. Sandra Briggs picked up with the tight, controlled voice of someone who had spent the morning waiting for news. This is Emily Carter. I was your father's nurse this morning. I know who you are. Sandra's voice cracked slightly on the last word. The doctor came in 2 hours ago. They moved him to the ICU. They said septic shock. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Is he stable? They're saying they caught it. They said another hour and Sandra stopped. Did you flag it? Before everything this morning? Was that you? Yes. A long pause. Thank you, Sandra said, and her voice was not controlled anymore. Emily put the phone down. She stood at the station for a moment, her hand still on the receiver, and then she turned and walked back toward the bay where Ardell was still sitting, and where, she saw as she approached, something had changed. Ardell was on his feet. Torres was beside him, and Cahill, who should have been sitting in Bay 2 with the plastics resident, was standing in the hallway with his arm extended, pointing at his phone. The expression on Ardell's face was the expression she had learned to read over years of watching him receive information in the field. Not panic, not surprise, but the rapid internal rearrangement of someone absorbing something that changed the shape of everything around it. She reached them and said, "What happened?" Ardell looked at her. "The investigation I mentioned, the secondary review on your file." He paused. It triggered an automatic flag in the federal system, and that flag was seen by someone we didn't expect. "Who?" "The Inspector General's office." He held up his phone. The screen showed a text message, 3 words visible before the preview cut off. She could read them clearly. "We're already here." The doors at the end of the hallway opened. 2 individuals in civilian clothes walked in. A man and a woman, both carrying credentials that caught the overhead light. Behind them, 2 more. And behind them, a figure Emily did not recognize, in a suit that was not expensive but was precise, with the kind of walk that said federal without saying it. Lawson appeared on the mezzanine above them. For the first time since 8:42 that morning, his face did not look controlled. The woman in front led the group. She was in her mid-40s with a short cropped haircut and the kind of posture that came from years of walking into rooms where people did not want her there. She held credentials in her left hand, not raised, not displayed for effect, just held, the way you held something when you were confident the room would ask to see it and you were prepared to wait. She did not look at Emily first, she looked at Ardell. "Colonel Ardell." Her voice was flat and professional. "Special Agent Dana Rourke, Department of Defense, Inspector General. We spoke 40 minutes ago." "You made good time," Ardell said. "We were already in West Haven." She said it without explaining further. The implication sat in the air like a question nobody was going to ask yet. Behind her, the 3 other agents had spread out in the way trained people spread out when they entered a space, not aggressively, but with the specific spatial awareness of individuals who were taking stock. One of them was already looking at the mezzanine where Lawson stood. Lawson had not moved. His hands were at his sides. His phone was in his right hand, gripped in a way that suggested he had either just finished a call or was deciding whether to make one. From this angle, 2 floors up and behind glass, his face was unreadable, but his body language was not. Too still, the stillness of a person who had just realized the walls of a room were closer than they'd thought. Rourke turned to Emily. "You're Carter." "Yes." "We need somewhere to talk. Private, if this hospital has that." Emily looked at Grace, who had appeared at the edge of the hallway in the way that Grace appeared at edges of things. Quietly, observationally, already knowing more than she showed. Grace said, "Conference room B, 2nd floor, north wing. It's empty." "Thank you." Rourke gestured to one of her agents, who peeled off toward the elevator with Torres in tow. Torres, who had apparently been contacted before Emily had, because she went without being asked and without the expression of someone being surprised. The walk to conference room B was 3 minutes. Emily spent it constructing the shape of what she knew and what she didn't. She knew about the file alteration Ardell had described. She knew about Meridian Health staffing and Lawson's brother-in-law. She knew what had been done to her this morning and what had been done to her, apparently, long before this morning. What she didn't know was the scale of it, whether this was one man protecting his position or something that had roots deeper than Richard Lawson's ego. She was about to find out. Conference room B had a long table, 8 chairs, and a wall-mounted screen that somebody had written a cardiology department budget projection on in marker and not fully erased. Rourke sat across from Emily. One agent posted near the door. The other set a laptop on the table and opened it. Ardell sat to Emily's left and did not speak. "I'm going to tell you what we know," Rourke said, "and then I'm going to ask you some questions. If there's something you'd rather have counsel present for, tell me now." "I don't need counsel," Emily said. "I haven't done anything." Rourke looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly but was not soft. "Nobody says that and means it the way they think they do. But, okay." She opened a folder. "Richard Lawson, Stonebridge Medical Center. You've been here 8 months." "Yes." In that time, you filed 4 internal reports, 2 flagging medication discrepancies, one regarding a post-surgical patient whose chart showed a procedure that the attending physician's operative note didn't match, one regarding a billing code pattern in the ER that you thought looked irregular. Emily went still. She had filed those reports. She had filed them through the hospital's internal compliance system, because that was the process, because she had been trained that when you saw something wrong, you documented it through the right channels and let the system work. She had not told anyone she filed them. She had not mentioned them to colleagues. She had assumed they went somewhere and did something, or didn't, and that she had done her part. You found those, she said. The compliance system logs everything, including who filed, when, and whether the report was reviewed. Rourke turned the folder so Emily could see the top document. Your 4 reports were received, logged, and closed, marked as reviewed by the Chief Administrator's Office, within 48 hours of submission. No external referral, no investigation initiated, no follow-up contact with you. Lawson saw them. Lawson saw them and buried them. Yes, Rourke pulled up the next document. The billing irregularities you flagged in Report 4, we've been tracking a version of that pattern for 7 months. A systematic upcoding scheme that has generated approximately $4.3 million in fraudulent Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements over the past 3 years. You found the edge of it in week 5 of your employment. The room was very quiet. He didn't just want to fire me, Emily said slowly. He needed me gone before I found the rest of it. Before you filed anything that went outside the building, yes. Your internal reports were containable. Another 3 months of you on this floor and something was going to make it out. Rourke paused. The performance notes, the complaint file, the arranged termination, that was all containment. Emily sat with that for a moment. 8 months of being looked at wrong, of being made to feel like she was too much, too sharp, too inconvenient, and underneath all of it was not some personality conflict or institutional friction. It was this. A man protecting $4 million and the infrastructure that generated it, using every tool available to remove the person who had wandered into his margins. The military record, she said. The notation that was added after my discharge. Rourke and Ardell exchanged a brief look. That's the piece that surprised us, Rourke said. Lawson has a contact in the VA record system. Former colleague, medical administrator, owes him professionally. The alteration was made at Lawson's request. The purpose was to give him leverage. If you ever pushed back hard enough that he needed to discredit you, he had a documented military performance issue he could surface. Emily looked at the table. She thought about the Caira Valley mission, which she did not discuss with anyone and had not discussed with anyone for 3 years. And the idea of Richard Lawson, a man who had never been in a room where the stakes were people's lives rather than his own position. Using that as a weapon was something that moved through her in a way she couldn't fully categorize. Not quite rage. Something colder. Has it been corrected? She asked. The record. It was flagged for correction the moment our review identified it. That process is underway. Rourke closed the folder. I want to ask you about the billing pattern you flagged, specifically the ER procedure codes in the 4th report. How did you identify it? Emily told her. It was a straightforward explanation. She had noticed that certain procedure codes were appearing on charts for patients she had treated, patients whose actual treatment she remembered clearly, and the codes didn't match what had been done. She had pulled a 2-week sample and documented it. She had not been trying to build a case. She had just been doing what she always did, which was paying attention to things that were wrong. Rourke listened without interrupting. The agent at the laptop was typing. When Emily finished, Rourke said, That documentation, your 4th report, is it only in the internal compliance system? I kept a copy. Ardell looked at her. On an external drive. At home. She paused. I keep copies of things I flag, in case internal channels don't, in case something doesn't move through the way it should. Rourke was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. We're going to need that drive. I'll get it. Not yet. Not until we've secured the process. If Lawson knows this meeting is happening, Rourke stopped, looked at the agent at the laptop. Something passed between them. He knows, the agent said without looking up from the screen. His attorney filed an emergency injunction request 40 minutes ago. He's arguing Carter's actions today constituted unauthorized medical practice and created hospital liability. He's trying to get ahead of the record. Emily said, "He's been building this all morning." "He's been building this for 8 months, Rourke said. "The problem is that this morning gave him new material. Every minute you spent in that trauma bay," to his attorney, "is a minute of unlicensed medical activity he can document." She looked at Emily directly. "How bad is the exposure?" Ardell answered before Emily could. 4 soldiers are alive who might not be because of what she did in that bay this morning. If Lawson wants to make that his argument, he's welcome to make it in front of a federal judge." Rourke did not look reassured by this exactly, but she nodded. "We're going to move fast. I need you to stay on hospital grounds and reachable. Can you do that?" "I'll stay," Emily said. Rourke stood. The meeting was over. On the way out, she paused at the door and turned back, and what she said next was not official, was clearly not part of the interview. It had a different quality to it, more like something she had thought about whether to say, and decided to. The people who filed those malpractice complaints he buried, 3 separate patients going back 2 years. One of them died 4 months after filing. She said it without inflection, just information. Then she left. Emily sat in the empty conference room for a minute after the door closed. Ardell stayed. "You okay?" he asked. "No," she said, which was honest. He nodded. That was enough. She went back to the ER floor. She went because sitting in a conference room did not help anyone, and because the floor was where she understood how to function, and because if Lawson was building a record of her unauthorized activity, then what she could do was be useful and visible, and let the people who needed to make decisions about her see exactly what she had done and why. The floor had changed while she was upstairs. Word had moved through the hospital the way word always moved through hospitals. Not announced, not official, just absorbed into the atmosphere until everyone knew without being told. The federal agents in the building, the fact that they had gone upstairs with Emily, the fact that Lawson had not come down from the mezzanine in the past hour, these things had moved through the staff and left a residue that Emily could feel when she walked back onto the floor. People were not behaving differently, exactly, but they were aware. Grace met her at the station. "Lawson's attorney is in the building." "I know." "He also called the chief of medicine. Dr. Vance is here now. He's in Lawson's office." Emily looked at the mezzanine swoop. The blinds had been partially drawn. "And the soldiers?" "Kellerman's patient is in recovery, stable. Osei's patient is in neuro-ICU, responsive. They got a pupil response on the left side an hour ago." Grace paused. "Reyes is upstairs waiting on an orthopedic consult. Cahill is in Bay 2 complaining about the food. That means he's fine." "Mostly." Grace looked at her. There was something in Grace's face that Emily had not seen before, not the careful neutrality of an 11-year institutional employee, but something more direct. "There's a patient in room 9, Walter Briggs. His daughter has been asking if you're still in the building." "I know. I called her. She asked if you could come up when you have time." Emily looked at the floor, not avoiding the question, just thinking. Then she said, "Cover me for 20 minutes." Room 9 was quieter than the ER. The ICU had taken Walter Briggs 3 hours ago. But Emily went to the room where he had been anyway, because Sandra Briggs was there, packing up the things her father had left. A cardigan, a pair of reading glasses, a phone charger. She looked up when Emily came in. "He's responding," Sandra said. "They're saying if the lactate keeps coming down—" She stopped, gathered herself. "The doctor who saw him this morning, he told me they caught it in time, that the chart flagged it before anyone looked. I documented what I saw." "Before they fired you?" "Yes." Sandra was quiet for a moment. She folded the cardigan with the careful attention of someone doing something ordinary because the alternative was too much. Then she said, "Is there something I can do? For what happened to you today?" "No," Emily said. And then, because it was true and Sandra seemed like someone who could handle true things, "But maybe. There may be a formal process. If so, someone may ask you to speak to what happened this morning. Would you be willing?" "Yes," Sandra said immediately. No hesitation. Emily nodded and left. She was halfway back to the elevator when her phone buzzed. Ardell. She read the message once, stopped walking, read it again. IG just served Lawson. Criminal referral, not civil. Federal wire fraud and falsification of government records. They're taking him in for formal questioning in 20 minutes. His attorney is fighting it. It's not going to work. She started walking again, faster. When she came out of the elevator onto the main floor, the lobby outside the administrative wing had a quality she recognized, the specific pressurized stillness that preceded something. 3 people from Rourke's team were outside Lawson's office door. The attorney, a man in a charcoal suit, was speaking rapidly in a low voice that he was trying to keep controlled. Through the glass wall, she could see Lawson standing at his desk. He was not on the phone anymore. He was looking down at something on his desk. From this distance, she could not tell what it was. Rourke stepped into the hallway and said something to the attorney that the attorney clearly did not like. He responded. She responded. He held up a document. She held up a different document. Fouls appeared from somewhere to Emily's left. He saw her, and something in his face went through several expressions quickly before settling into something she could only describe as a man realizing he had boarded a ship that was going down and that the time for choosing a different ship had passed. She did not say anything to him. The door to Lawson's office opened. Lawson came out. He was still in his suit. He still looked composed in the external way, posture correct, chin level. But his eyes, when they found Emily across the hallway, had something in them that she had not seen before. Not guilt, exactly. Something more fundamental than guilt. Something that lived underneath. Recognition. Of what he had done and what was coming. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then Rourke's hand was on his arm, and the attorney was speaking again, and the formal machinery of consequence was moving around him the way it moved when it had enough evidence and enough authority and didn't need to hurry because there was nowhere left to go. Emily stood in the hallway and watched, and then her phone buzzed again. A different number. She didn't recognize it. She answered. "Is this Emily Carter?" A voice she didn't know. Male, careful, official. "Yes. This is Major Theo Winslow, JAG Corbs. I've been assigned to your case by Colonel Ardell's office." A pause. "Ms. Carter, I've been reviewing the alteration to your military discharge record, the retroactive notation." Another pause, longer. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." "Okay. The Kyra Valley mission. Your discharge came 18 months after that operation. Is there anyone outside your chain of command who knew the specific details of your medical decisions that day? Anyone civilian? Anyone with access to after-action reports who shouldn't have had it?" Emily stood very still in the middle of the hallway, because she did know. There was one person, someone she had never associated with Stonebridge or with Richard Lawson or with any of this. Someone from a different chapter entirely. "Yes," she said slowly. "There's one person." "Who?" She said the name. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that she checked to make sure the call was still connected. When Winslow spoke again, his voice had changed. "Ms. Carter, I need you to stay exactly where you are and not speak to anyone until I call you back." The call ended. Down the hall, Lawson was being walked toward the elevator. His attorney was still talking. Nobody was listening to the attorney. Fouls was against the wall with the expression of a man cataloging everything he'd said in the past 8 months and wondering which parts would matter. Emily stood in the hallway with her phone in her hand and a name in her head that had just cracked the shape of everything she thought she understood about the past 3 years, and the next call from Major Winslow could not come fast enough. She stayed where she was, not because Winslow had told her to, though he had, but because the name she had just said out loud was still sitting in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward in every direction, and she needed a moment to let them settle before she moved. The name was Dr. Philip Garrett. Garrett had been a civilian medical consultant embedded with the forward operating base during the Kyra Valley deployment. He had access to after-action reports. He had been present for the debrief that followed the mission, the one where Emily's decisions had been reviewed, where the chain of command had ultimately cleared her, where nothing negative had been entered into any record because there was nothing negative to enter. He had been quiet during that debrief, attentive. She had not thought much about him afterward. He had cycled out of the FOB 2 weeks later, and she had never seen him again. She had also never known, until approximately 40 seconds ago, that she had a reason to think about him. She thought about him now. Garrett had been brought in through a DoD contractor program, she remembered that. Independent consulting arrangement, some kind of specialized trauma assessment role. She had not known his full background. You didn't always know, out there, and it wasn't always relevant. He had been professional, quiet, and thorough in the way that some civilian consultants were thorough, observationally cataloging everything. She had assumed at the time that it was professional rigor. The hallway was emptying around her. Lawson had been moved toward the administrative wing with Rourke's team. The attorney had followed, still talking to no one in particular. Fouls had disappeared somewhere. The ordinary noise of the hospital floor was reasserting itself. Monitors, footsteps, the PA system calling for a technician to radiology. Her phone rang. Winslow. She answered on the first ring. "Talk to me," she said. "Philip Garrett." Winslow's voice was controlled but faster than it had been 20 minutes ago. "Do you know where he's been since the Cairo Valley deployment?" "No." "He left federal contracting 18 months after you did. He went private sector, healthcare administration consulting." Emily said nothing, but something in her went very still. "His current client list," Winslow said, "includes 3 hospital systems. All 3 have faced federal billing fraud investigations in the past 2 years. All 3 use the same compliance structure. Internal reporting channels routed through the chief administrator's office. No external referral, systematic closure of internal flags." "He's not just Lawson's source," Emily said. "He designed the system. He appears to have consulted on its implementation at Stonebridge approximately 14 months ago. We're still pulling documentation." A pause. "There's more. The performance notation added to your military file, the metadata trail we've been running. The access credentials used to enter the VA record system match a contractor ID that was last associated with Garrett's consulting firm." The stone hit deeper water. "He's the one who flagged me," she said. "He reviewed the after-action from Cairo Valley. He knew I had seen irregularities in that debrief, even if nothing was ever filed, and when Lawson needed a compliance threat removed, he pointed him at me. That's the theory we're working with. What I need to know is whether Garrett ever had additional contact with you after the FOB. Anything outside the formal debrief. Anything that felt irregular at the time." She thought, carefully, because the answer to this question mattered, and she was not going to approximate it. She went back through the 2 weeks she had overlapped with Garrett, scene by scene, the way she had trained herself to review patient encounters, not impressionistically, but specifically. "Once," she said, 2 days before he cycled out, he asked to review my field notes from the Cairo Valley response. Said it was for his assessment report. I let him photograph the pages." "Were those notes in your official record?" "No, they were personal, working notes I kept separately." Winslow was quiet for exactly the length of time it took to understand what that meant. "He had details about your decisions that weren't in the official after-action." "Yes." "Which means when Lawson needed to build a case against your military record, Garrett could provide specifics that would make the fabricated notation look credible, context that only someone who had been there would know." "Yes," Emily said again. "Okay." Winslow took a breath. "Here's where we are. Rourke's team has Lawson in formal questioning. The billing fraud referral is active. The record's falsification is a separate federal charge. That one is solid because the metadata doesn't lie, and the contractor ID creates a direct link. What we need is to connect Garrett explicitly, which means we need documentation of his consulting arrangement with Stonebridge, his communication with Lawson, and ideally anything that shows this was coordinated targeting rather than coincidence. The external drive I mentioned to Rourke, my 4th compliance report, the billing irregularities. If Garrett designed the system, there will be signatures in the structure that match his other clients. Rourke would recognize it if she compared them. She's already requested records from the other 2 hospital systems. That comparison is going to happen." A pause. "Emily, is there anything else Garrett might have that he could use? Anything from Cairo Valley or after that could be weaponized?" She thought about it honestly. Not performing certainty, actually thinking. No, she said finally. I did my job. I documented what I did and why. The decisions were sound, and the chain of command agreed. Garrett can contextualize all he wants. The substance is clean. Good. Winslow sounded like he meant it. I'll call you when we have more on Garrett. Stay on hospital grounds. The call ended. Emily put her phone in her pocket and stood in the corridor for a moment, orienting. Then she walked back to the ER floor because that was where she knew how to function, and because Cahill was still in Bay 2 and Reyes was still upstairs, and the ordinary work of the day did not stop for anyone's criminal investigation. Grace was at the station. She looked up when Emily came in. How bad? Grace asked. It's moving. Lawson's attorney has been calling the chief of medicine every 20 minutes. Dr. Vance keeps asking the ER charge staff whether you were clinically supervised this morning. What are they saying? Depends who you ask. Grace said it without inflection, which meant the answers were not uniformly favorable. The residents who were in the bay mostly said yes. A couple of the attendings are being careful. Careful means they're watching to see which way it falls. Yes. Emily nodded. It was not surprising. Institutions protected themselves. The people in them did the same, and she had known this morning, when she stepped back into that bay, that the legal and professional complexity of what she was doing was something she was choosing rather than something she was unaware of. She had chosen it because there were men bleeding on gurneys, and that was not a complicated calculation. She checked on Cahill. He was in Bay 2 with his leg wrapped and an institutional turkey sandwich that he had eaten approximately half of and abandoned. He looked better than he had. Some of the controlled exhaustion had moved into something more like ordinary tired. Kellerman's patient, he said when Emily came in. The femoral, is he going to walk? Ask Kellerman. I'm asking you. She looked at him. The repair held. His pressure has been stable for 3 hours. The next 48 are going to tell you more than I can right now. Cahill nodded. He looked at the half-finished sandwich. He's been in my unit for 4 years, he said. It was not said for sympathy. It was just a fact, delivered with the specific weight of someone for whom 4 years in a unit meant something that didn't translate cleanly to civilian language. I know, Emily said. She did not say anything else, and neither did he. And somehow that was the right amount. She went up to check on Reyes. He was in a standard room on the 3rd floor, his arm in a stabilizing brace, irritated about the television remote not working and otherwise alert. The orthopedic consult had come and gone. He would need a second procedure in the next week, but the immediate repair was holding. He recognized Emily when she came in the door. You're the one who ran the bay, he said, along with a lot of other people. He studied her for a moment. He had the assessing look of someone who had spent years reading situations for threat and was now applying it to a different kind of question. Ardell said they tried to fire you this morning. They did fire me. This morning. But you stayed. There were people who needed care. He was quiet. Then, Ardell doesn't impress easy. You should know that. I do know that. He looked at his arm. Thank you, he said. Not elaborated, not performed, just 2 words delivered in the direction of something real. She went back downstairs. The shift supervisor had changed by now, afternoon crew coming on, and the information had moved further through the building. When Emily walked through the ER, she was aware of being looked at differently than she had been at 9 in the morning. Not with the pitying, avoidant attention of the walkout, something else. Something more complicated and less comfortable. People who had watched her get escorted to the door 3 hours ago were now watching her move through the floor as if recalibrating something they had assumed without checking. She was not interested in what they thought. She was interested in the monitors and the charts and the work. But she noticed. Oscar found her at the medication cart at 2:45. He was young, 23, still in his ER tech certification, working nights to pay for his final year of nursing school. He had worked alongside Emily every shift for 8 months, and had handed her supplies that morning without asking questions. I put in a formal witness statement, he said. He said it quietly and directly, the way he said most things. About this morning. What happened in the bay, the sequence, what you did. They asked if anyone wanted to submit one. Who asked? The federal agents. Rourke. He shrugged. I figured someone should say it clearly. Emily looked at him. He was slightly uncomfortable being looked at, which was usual. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, and he had not announced it or waited for acknowledgement, which was also usual. Thank you, Oscar, she said. He nodded and went back to work. At 3:15, the board meeting happened. She knew it was happening because Grace told her and because she could see through the glass walls of the second-floor conference room a collection of individuals who had the professional bearing of people sitting in judgment. The Stonebridge Board of Directors, 7 of them, called to an emergency session. Dr. Vance was in there. 2 of the senior physicians. Rourke's team had provided documentation before the meeting started, which Grace also knew because Grace knew everything that moved through this building. Emily did not go up. She was not invited. She waited on the floor, and she worked, and she let the process happen in rooms she wasn't in, because she had put her evidence in the right hands, and she understood that some things had to finish without her in them. The board meeting lasted 90 minutes. What came out of it arrived at the ER floor not through any official channel, but through the specific informal network of a hospital staff that was paying attention. Dr. Vance had come down first, at 4:47, and spoken to Grace for 6 minutes. Then Grace had come to find Emily. Lawson is suspended pending the federal investigation, Grace said. Fowles is suspended as well. Apparently there are questions about his involvement in the complaint file. The board has appointed an interim administrator. She paused, and they've asked HR to formally review your termination. Emily said, review, not reverse. Review is the word they used. Grace looked at her steadily. But the tone was the other thing. Emily nodded. She went to the locker room at 5 o'clock and sat on the bench and looked at the floor. The day had been 11 hours of sustained pressure, and she could feel it now in a way she hadn't been allowing herself to feel it. Not collapse, just the particular heaviness that came when your body understood that the acute phase was over and presented you with the bill. She thought about Cara Valley. She did so deliberately, the way she sometimes did when something from that period surfaced. Not avoiding it, not dwelling in it, just looking at it directly enough to confirm it still had the same shape. 3 operators and a translator, 2 kilometers from extraction, a structure collapse, 4 casualties including one that could not be saved no matter what she did. She had made the right calls in the right order. She knew that then. She knew it now. The fact that Garrett had photographed her field notes and handed them to a man who wanted to use them as a weapon did not change what had actually happened. What it changed was what she understood about the past 3 years. Her phone buzzed. Winslow. We have Garrett, he said. She straightened. Where? He was in West Haven, has been for the past 2 weeks, which is why Rourke's team was already in the area when Ardell's flag triggered. A pause. He was not here by coincidence. Lawson was escalating his plan to remove you, and Garrett came to assist with the implementation. We have hotel records, communication logs between Garrett and Lawson going back 11 months, and a draft document on Garrett's laptop that appears to be a template for the licensing board complaint that Lawson's attorney was preparing to file this afternoon. A template, Emily said. He's used it before. 2 of the 3 other hospital systems we identified. Both cases involved a nurse or mid-level provider who filed internal compliance complaints. Both were removed within 90 days. One lost her license. The other took a settlement agreement that included a non-disclosure clause. Winslow's voice was flat. Not angry. JAG officers did not perform anger at her, but the flatness had a weight to it. You are not the first person he did this to. You're the first one who had a colonel with a bleeding team show up at the right moment. She absorbed that. The other 2. A nurse who lost her license, someone who signed an NDA and went away. Garrett had refined this somewhere before Stonebridge. She was not a test case. She was an iteration. What happens to him? She asked. Federal charges. Falsification of government records is a felony. The conspiracy angle, coordinating the targeting of multiple individuals across state lines, that adds significantly. His attorney is going to argue consulting arrangements and professional opinion, but the metadata is not going to cooperate with that argument. Winslow paused. He'll be formally taken in tonight. She sat with that for a moment. And my record, she said. The correction is already filed. The notation has been flagged as fraudulent and will be formally expunged. Your discharge record will reflect what it should have reflected from the beginning. Honorable, no negative notations, full commendation from your commanding officer." His voice shifted slightly. "Colonel Ardell submitted a supplementary letter this afternoon. I don't usually read those, but I read this one." Emily didn't ask what was in it. She didn't need to. "Thank you, Major," she said. She put the phone down and sat on the bench in the locker room and let herself have 60 seconds of not moving, not performing composure, not managing the next thing, just sitting in a room that smelled like industrial soap and the residue of other people's hard days, being a person who had been through something and was still here. 60 seconds. Then she got up. When she came back out to the floor at 5:40, something had changed in the building. Not the ER specifically. The ER was the ER, always moving, always absorbing the next thing. But the building. The particular atmosphere that a large institution develops when something happens that everyone knows about and nobody has officially announced. She found out why at 6:03. Rourke's team had moved Lawson from the administrative questioning to formal custodial custody at 5:50. They had not used the administrative wing exit. They had come through the main lobby, in front of the reception desk, in front of the patient family waiting area, in front of the afternoon shift staff coming in, and the day shift going home, and the residents crossing between departments and the security desk where Dale sat and saw everything. Richard Lawson, in his suit, being walked through the front lobby of Stonebridge Medical Center with his attorney at his side and federal agents on either side of him, with the specific quality of movement that said this was not voluntary and there was no ambiguity about that. Emily was not in the lobby when it happened. She heard about it from 3 separate people in the space of 10 minutes, each account slightly different in detail, but identical in the central fact, which was that it had been public and it had been documented. Someone had filmed it on a phone, which was going to be a problem for the attorney and a fact that could not be unwound. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. She felt something that was adjacent to relief but more complicated. The feeling of a structure that has been holding against pressure finally being allowed to relax. It was not clean. Nothing about today had been clean. Fouls found her near the station at 6:20. She had not been looking for him and did not think he had been specifically looking for her. He had materialized with the look of a man who had decided he needed to say something and was not sure how to start it. He was not suspended until the following morning. She would learn later. At this moment, he still had his badge and his floor access and his prior certainty, all 3 of which looked considerably less stable than they had at 8:30 that morning. "The complaint file," he said. His voice was careful. "The notes I submitted about your conduct." "Yes." "Some of them were—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Lawson asked me to document interactions. He said it was standard administrative process. I didn't ask why." Emily looked at him. A man who spent 8 years serving in the Army Medical Corps was systematically targeted, had her federal record falsified, and was set up to be professionally destroyed. And you didn't ask why you were being asked to build the file. He looked at the floor. "No," she said. "You should talk to the investigators." "I know. Tonight, not tomorrow." He nodded once, still looking at the floor, and walked away. She watched him go and felt nothing in particular. Not anger, not forgiveness, just the clear-eyed recognition of a person who had made a small, convenient choice that contributed to a larger harm and was now standing inside the consequences of it. The evening moved through its ordinary rhythms. New patients came in. The post-afternoon shift settled. Emily stayed on the floor because she did not have a clear status, not formally reinstated, not formally anything, suspended in the space between what had been done to her and what was being corrected. And Grace had told her to stay, and Dr. Vance had not told her to leave, and the patients were there, so she worked. At 7:45, Ardell came to find her. He had been in and out of the building all day, phone calls, meetings with Rourke's team, coordinating with his own chain of command about the operators upstairs. He looked tired in a way that he was not going to acknowledge, and she was not going to point out. He sat in the chair beside the station and looked at the floor. "Kellerman's patient is going to need physical therapy," he said. "They're saying full recovery is probable, not certain." "Probable is good." "It is." He looked up. Yunt's left pupil is responding. Osei says the pressure is fully resolved. He was quiet for a moment. That one was close. Yes, she said. It had been. The margin between calling for neurosurgery when she did and calling for it 20 minutes later was the margin between Yunt being in the neuro ICU recovering and Yunt being something else. She was aware of that. She would probably be aware of it for a long time. The board requested a statement from me, Ardell said, about this morning, my observations of your actions in the trauma bay. What did you tell them? The truth. He paused. Which included the fact that every clinical decision you made was within the range of what I have observed from senior combat medical personnel in active field conditions. And that in my professional assessment, at least 2 of my operators are alive because you made those decisions without being paralyzed by the question of whether you were technically authorized to make them. Emily said nothing. The interim administrator, a woman named Dr. Hartley, she's been medical director at their satellite clinic. She called me directly after the board meeting. He looked at Emily. She wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. About what? She said she'd prefer to discuss it in person. He paused. She used the word future, specifically your future at this hospital. Emily sat with that for a moment. The ER floor moved around her. Oscar at the cart, Maria on the phone, the monitors doing their constant quiet work. The linoleum floor with the crack that maintenance still hadn't fixed. The fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below noticeable. Okay, she said finally. Ardell stood. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had things to say and had decided that the current moment was not the right container for them. Then he said, "Get some sleep tonight," and walked out. She stayed until 9, finished her documentation, handed off to the night nurse, told Grace she would be back in the morning, and walked out through the main entrance, the same doors they had walked her toward that morning before the convoy arrived. The parking lot was quiet. The night air was cool and slightly damp, the kind of air that arrived in early autumn before anyone was ready for it. She stood outside for a moment and looked at the building. Her phone buzzed one more time. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she had not heard in 3 years. Emily? Careful, controlled, recognizably the same. I think we should talk. Philip Garrett. Not in custody yet. Winslow had said tonight it was 9:04. The math was not right. How did you get this number? She said. I have resources. A pause. I want you to understand something before this goes any further. What you think you know about Kyra Valley, what you think the record shows, there are pieces of it you don't have, and the people who have them are not going to use them the way you're expecting. Her hand tightened on the phone. I'm listening, she said, because she needed to know what he had and whether it was real or a threat with nothing behind it. And because some part of her that was still a combat medic understood that you gathered information before you moved. Not on the phone. His voice was steady, almost professional, as if this were a consulting call, and not a man trying to find leverage while federal agents were somewhere in this city with his name on a warrant. There's a diner 3 blocks from the hospital, Kendall's. I'm there now. If you come, I'll tell you everything. If you don't... He stopped. Let the silence carry the implication. She stared at the hospital entrance. Give me 15 minutes, she said. She hung up, turned around, and walked back through the doors, straight to the ER station, where she picked up the phone and called Rourke's cell. He's at Kendall's Diner, she said when Rourke answered. 3 blocks north of the hospital. He called me directly. He thinks I'm coming alone in 15 minutes. A pause. Don't go. I know, Emily said. But you should. Rourke's team reached Kendall's Diner in 11 minutes. Emily knew this because Rourke called her back at 9:22 to confirm that Garrett had been taken into custody without incident, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee he had barely touched, and a phone on the table in front of him that contained, according to the initial review, 11 months of encrypted communication with Richard Lawson, drafts of fabricated documentation, and a folder of photographs that included images of Emily's handwritten field notes from Kyra Valley. The same notes he had photographed 3 years ago in a forward operating base, kept and held in reserve like a weapon he hadn't needed to use yet. He thought you were coming, Rourke said. He had a prepared statement, written out. He was going to offer you a deal. His silence about Kyra Valley in exchange for yours about Stonebridge. What did he think he had on Kyra Valley? His version of your field notes, reframed. He'd written a narrative around them that made your decisions look like deviation rather than judgment. A pause. It wouldn't have held up. The after-action documentation is clear, and the chain of command review is on record. But it would have been ugly, and he knew that, and he was counting on you knowing it too. Emily stood in the hospital parking lot where she had been standing for the past 20 minutes in the cool September air, looking at nothing in particular. He miscalculated. Significantly. Rourke's voice had something in it that was as close to dry satisfaction as a federal agent's voice got during an active operation. He's in custody. The phone is in evidence. We'll have a full forensic review within 48 hours, and based on what the initial screen is showing, the communication record alone is going to close this without ambiguity. A pause. Get some sleep, Carter. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Emily put the phone in her pocket and stood in the parking lot for another minute. The thing about adrenaline was that it was a loan, not a gift. You borrowed from tomorrow's reserves and tomorrow collected. And what she felt standing in the Stonebridge parking lot at 9:30 in the evening was the full weight of what today had taken, and a tiredness that went down to the bone. Not broken, not even close to broken, just emptied out in the specific way that came after sustained pressure, when the body finally understood it was allowed to stop. She drove home. Her apartment was 12 minutes from the hospital, a second-floor unit in a building that was clean and unremarkable, which was exactly what she had wanted when she moved to West Haven 8 months ago. She had not put much on the walls. She had not spent time making it into something that looked like permanence, because she had not known yet whether she was staying, and then she had been too busy surviving Stonebridge to think about curtains. She heated soup she found in the cabinet. She sat at the kitchen table and ate it, and stared at the surface of the table and let her mind do nothing in particular for 45 minutes. Then she slept, and it was the deep, immediate sleep of someone who had given everything they had and had nothing left to spend on being awake. She was back at the hospital at 7:15 the next morning. The building felt different in the way that buildings felt different when something had fundamentally changed inside them. Same floors, same lights, same PA system calling for the same things. But the particular institutional atmosphere that Lawson had created over 9 years, the low-level tension, the careful navigation, the performance of deference, had a crack in it that even the physical space seemed to register. Grace was at the station. She looked up when Emily came in and said, without preamble, "Fould submitted his statement to the investigators last night, all of it. Good." He named 3 other physicians who contributed complaint notes at Lawson's request. HR is pulling their files. Grace looked at her tablet. Also, a patient family filed a formal complaint this morning about a 2021 surgical outcome. Says they raised it internally 2 years ago and were told it had been reviewed. One of Lawson's buried cases. Looks like it. Grace set the tablet down. There are going to be more. Emily nodded. She already knew that. The structure Lawson had built was the kind of structure that looked solid from the outside and hollow from the inside. And when it came down, it would come down in pieces over weeks and months. Each buried complaint surfacing, each falsified document identified, each patient or provider who had been silenced finding their way back to some version of the record that reflected what had actually happened. It was not going to be clean or fast. Rourke's investigation would take time. The legal proceedings would take longer. Justice, she had learned, was rarely a single moment. It was more often a slow accumulation of correct things happening in the right direction. She met with Dr. Hartley at 8 o'clock. The interim administrator had taken a small office on the second floor, not Lawson's office, which was sealed pending the investigation, but a consultation room that had been cleared and furnished with a desk and 2 chairs and a working coffee machine, which immediately told Emily something about what kind of administrator Hartley was. She was in her late 50s, compact, with reading glasses that she took off and put on with the decisive energy of someone who thought faster than paperwork moved. She had been medical director of the satellite clinic for 6 years and had the specific practical competence of someone who had run a resource-limited facility and made it work. "Sit down," she said when Emily came in. "Coffee?" "Please." She poured 2 cups and sat down without the desk between them, which was also informative. "I'm going to be direct. Hartley said, because I don't have the patience for the other approach, and I suspect you don't either. She looked at Emily over the rim of her cup. What happened yesterday was a significant institutional failure. The termination was procedurally questionable at best and based on fabricated documentation at worst, and the events that followed made that fact extremely visible to a federal investigation, a military command structure, and the hospital board. She paused. We would like to formally reinstate your employment, immediately, with full back pay for the period of wrongful termination. Emily said, I want that in writing before I agree to anything. Already drafted. HR has it ready. Hartley looked at her without flinching. I also want to talk about something else. Emily waited. Stonebridge has a trauma training program, or it had one. It's been largely ceremonial for the past 4 years, underfunded and underrun. Part of what Lawson did to protect his operation was keep the clinical education function weak. Providers who know more ask more questions, and he didn't want questions. Hartley set her cup down. We want to rebuild it, substantively. A functioning emergency trauma training program that actually prepares the staff for what they're going to face. Mass casualty events, field condition improvisation, high-pressure triage. She looked at Emily steadily. Colonel Ardell has indicated that the Special Operations medical community would be interested in a formal partnership arrangement. Training exchanges, protocol development, scenario-based education drawn from actual field medicine. She paused one beat. We'd like you to direct it. Emily sat with that. Not because she was surprised, exactly. Ardell had said Hartley wanted to discuss her future, and she had spent the drive in this morning letting herself think about what that might mean. But hearing it stated directly still required a moment. Director of Emergency Trauma Training, not a nursing floor position. Not a role defined by what she was allowed to do within someone else's hierarchy. A role defined by what she built. What's the budget? She said. Hartley's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile. That's the right question. She pushed a folder across the space between them. Preliminary numbers. We're in discussion with the board about expanding the line item significantly. What's in there is the floor, not the ceiling. Emily opened the folder. She looked at the numbers. They were not perfect. The floor was lower than she would have liked, and some of the line items were optimistic. But they were real, and the ceiling being unset was the meaningful part. I want clinical authority over the training protocols, she said. Not advisory. Authority. If I'm building this program, I'm building it to the standard I know works, not the standard that's comfortable. Agreed. And I want Oscar Ruiz cross-trained in the program. He's a second-year nursing student who has been doing ER tech work here for 8 months. He's good. Hartley nodded. Done. Emily closed the folder. Give me the reinstatement paperwork. The paperwork took 40 minutes, which was fast for HR, and suggested that someone had been moving things around behind the scenes since at least the evening before. Emily signed where she was supposed to sign and initialed where she was supposed to initial, and thought, while doing it, about the first time she had signed into Stonebridge, 8 months ago. A placement call from an agency she had trusted, a new city, a hospital that had seemed reasonable. She had not known then what she was walking into. She had not known about Lawson or Garrett or the frame being built around her. She had just been a person looking for work in a field she was good at, and she had done that work the only way she knew how, which was as well as she could, and that had been enough to make her dangerous to the wrong people. She thought that was probably the most honest version of what had happened. Not heroism, not destiny, just someone doing their job with enough competence and enough conscience that a corrupt man felt threatened. The paperwork came back with her badge clipped to it. She looked at the badge for a moment. It had a different title on it than the one she'd surrendered yesterday. They had updated it to reflect the new role, which was either efficiency or symbolism, and she decided not to overanalyze it. She put it on. By 10:30, word had moved through the building in the complete way that word moved through buildings when the story was finally finished and there was nothing left to contain. Emily Carter, reinstated. Emily Carter, new director of trauma training. The federal investigation, the arrests, the formal suspension of Foulds and 2 other physicians, the sealed administrative wing, the patient family complaints being reopened. All of it together painted a picture that the hospital staff absorbed piece by piece until the whole shape of it was visible. She ran into Maria in the break room at 11. Maria was holding a coffee and looking at the counter with the expression of someone reviewing her own choices. "I watched them take your badge yesterday," Maria said. "I didn't say anything." "I know. I should have." Emily looked at her. Maria was a good nurse. Careful, fast, clinically solid. She had also been at Stonebridge for 5 years under Lawson, which meant 5 years of learning exactly which lines not to cross and exactly how much friction was safe. That kind of learning didn't erase itself overnight. "You handed me supplies in the trauma bay without being asked," Emily said. "When it mattered, you moved." Maria was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one." Emily picked up her coffee. "People make the choices they make in the moment they're in. The moments were different." She left Maria in the break room and went back to work. The formal part of the day that she had been dreading and had been actively not thinking about because dreading things in advance was not useful, happened at 2 in the afternoon. Rourke called to give her the update on Lawson. He had been formally charged that morning. Federal wire fraud, healthcare fraud, falsification of government records in connection with the alteration of Emily's military file, obstruction of official proceedings, and conspiracy. The last charge covering the coordinated targeting of complainants across multiple facilities. His attorney had spent the morning arguing jurisdiction and bail conditions and had not made significant progress on either. The fraud charges alone carried potential sentences in the range of 15 to 20 years, and the conspiracy charge extended that further. "He'll negotiate," Rourke said. "They always negotiate. But the evidence base is not going to give him much room." "The other hospitals," Emily said. "The nurse who lost her license. We've been in contact. Both cases are being reopened. The licensing board has been formally notified regarding the fraudulent documentation used against the first complainant. That process will take time, but it's moving." A pause. "The family of the patient who died after filing a malpractice complaint, they've been contacted. The case is being reopened through the civil system." Emily said, "What about Garrett?" "Garrett is not negotiating. His attorney is arguing he was providing legitimate consulting services and that the nature of those services has been mischaracterized." Rourke's voice carried the specific flatness of someone who found an argument professionally unimpressive. "The phone record is going to be the end of that argument. 11 months of documented coordination, including several exchanges where the targeting of specific individuals is discussed explicitly." A pause. "He faces federal charges on the records falsification alone. The conspiracy extension means he's looking at comparable exposure to Lawson." Emily was standing at the window of the small office that had been assigned to her. It was a converted storage room, which was fine. It had a window and a desk and more square footage than she strictly needed, and she looked out at the parking lot where the military convoy had pulled up 29 hours ago. The lot was empty now except for ordinary cars, the ordinary afternoon traffic of a mid-sized regional hospital going about its day. "Thank you," she said to Rourke. "Don't thank me. Your compliance reports and your external documentation are what built this case. You did it 8 months ago and didn't know you'd done it." A pause, and then something shifted in Rourke's voice. Not softer exactly, but less official. "For what it's worth, you made the right call on every decision I've observed you make in the past 24 hours. The trauma bay, the Garrett call, all of it." Emily didn't say anything. "That's not something I say to people as a matter of course," Rourke said. "I know," Emily said. "Thank you." The call ended. She sat down at the desk in the converted storage room and pulled out a legal pad and started writing. Not a report, not documentation, a list. What the trauma training program needed to be. What it needed to do. The gap between what Stonebridge staff could currently handle and what field condition emergency care actually looked like. The specific scenarios they needed to train for. The skills that were never taught in standard nursing or residency programs because they came from environments that clinical education had not historically touched. She wrote for 90 minutes without stopping. It was not a plan yet. It was the shape of a plan, the rough geography of something that didn't exist and needed to. She had spent 8 months being smaller than she was because the institution around her was built to keep certain people small. She had some time to make up. Ardell came at 4. He did not call ahead. He arrived in the ER, asked Grace where Emily was, and came to the converted storage room, where he stood in the doorway and looked at the legal pad covered in her handwriting and the coffee cup with the pen resting in it and said, "You look like you're already 3 months into a job you accepted 4 hours ago." 6 months, she said. I was conservative on the timeline. He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk. He looked tired in the way he had looked last night. The kind of tired that was going to take more than one night to address. Behind it, though, something had released. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. "Kellerman's patient walked to the window this morning," he said. Unaided. The therapist wasn't expecting it. Emily felt something open in her chest. Good. Yunt's family flew in last night. His wife. Ardell looked at the window. She asked who the nurse was who called for neurosurgery. I told her. She wants to meet you. I'd like that. Reyes is already asking when he can be discharged. He almost smiled. Cahill ate 3 hospital breakfasts this morning, which the nursing staff found alarming. Tell them that's normal for him. I did. He was quiet for a moment. The supplementary letter I submitted to the board, about your performance during the Kyra Valley deployment and your service record generally. Emily waited. I should have submitted something like it 3 years ago, he said. When you left, I should have asked more questions about the circumstances, and I didn't. I told myself your discharge was your choice and that it wasn't my place to push. He looked at the desk. That was a failure of leadership on my part. James. She used his first name, which she almost never did, because what she needed to say required it. I made decisions. Some of them I've questioned. Some of them I've stood behind. I left when I left for reasons that were mine, and then someone used those reasons against me, and that was not something you could have predicted. She paused. You showed up yesterday with a convoy and 4 bleeding men, and you told a hospital administrator to step aside. You don't owe me an apology. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that was too contained to name. The partnership with Stonebridge, he said. The training program. I've already had 2 commanders reach out since Rourke's office sent the preliminary report. There's significant interest in the model. Field to civilian skill transfer, real scenario training, bilateral exchange. He paused. It could be bigger than one hospital. I know, Emily said. That's what the list is. He looked at the legal pad again, and this time he did something she had seen him do approximately twice in 8 years of knowing him, which was let an expression of genuine, unguarded respect cross his face without immediately replacing it with something more controlled. He stood. Get some sleep tonight. You said that last night. You also didn't listen last night. You went to the parking lot and answered a call from a federal fugitive. And it worked out. It did. He paused at the door. It almost always does with you. That's not luck. He left without waiting for a response, which was typical, and which she had always understood was his way of saying things he would not say if he gave himself the opportunity to reconsider them. The ceremony happened 2 weeks later. Emily had not been told the full scope of it. She had been told there would be a formal recognition, a military commendation review that Ardell's command had expedited, combined with a hospital acknowledgement of her reinstatement and the launch of the trauma training program. She had expected something modest, a conference room, some paperwork, a few people. She walked out the main entrance at 9 a.m. and stopped. The parking lot in front of Stonebridge Medical Center had been cleared. Rows of people stood in formation on one side, special operations personnel, in dress uniform, more than she had expected, 20 at least, maybe more. On the other side, hospital staff, not required attendance, not a mandatory event, people who had chosen to come, and the number of them was larger than she would have predicted. Grace was there, Oscar, in a button-down shirt that suggested he had put in effort. Maria. Torres, the military medic, in uniform. Dr. Osei, her surgical cap replaced with civilian clothes. Dr. Kellerman, who caught Emily's eye and nodded once. Sandra Briggs was there. She was standing near the back with her father, who was in a wheelchair, and looked considerably more present than he had in room 9 2 weeks ago. He caught Emily's eye and raised one hand in a small, deliberate acknowledgement. Yunt's wife was there, with a woman Emily didn't know who was holding a baby. Yunt himself was not. He was still in recovery, and the distance was not clearable yet. but the presence of his family was its own statement. Reyes and Cahill were there, in civilian clothes, standing slightly apart from the formation in the way that operators stood when they were off duty. At ease, but not entirely at ease, the way it took people time to shed. Local media had positioned themselves at the edge of the lot. A reporter Emily didn't know was speaking into a camera, city council members, the hospital board in a row. And at the front of all of it, Colonel James Ardell, in full dress uniform with Major Winslow beside him holding a case that Emily recognized. She walked out to them. Ardell spoke first to the assembled crowd, but he was not the kind of man who made speeches longer than they needed to be, so what he said was efficient and true and did not dress anything up. He described the events of 2 weeks ago, the mission, the convoy, the hospital, the trauma bay. He described what Emily had done and what had been done to her, and how those two things existed in the same morning. He said that the Army did not forget the people who served it, and that sometimes the system moves slower than it should, and that what was happening today was the system catching up. Then he turned to Emily and opened the case and said, "Sergeant Emily Carter, in recognition of your service and the life-saving actions performed both during active military deployment and in continued civilian practice, it is my honor to present the Military Outstanding Civilian Service Medal." She had not expected that specific commendation. She kept her face still, which cost her something, and stepped forward and let him pin it, and the assembled soldiers snapped to attention and rendered salute, 20-some pairs of hands rising in unison, and she returned it because it was the right thing to do and because she had earned the right to return it, and she was going to let herself know that. No one spoke for a moment. Then Cahill, who was standing to the left and had apparently decided the moment called for it, started clapping. Reyes joined him. Then the hospital staff, and then it was general and sustained, and Emily stood in the middle of it and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the specific weight of being fully seen by the people whose perception of you had been distorted, and having that distortion corrected publicly and completely and without ambiguity. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was not a triumphant feeling, not in the clean way that triumph looked in movies. It was more complicated than that. Gratitude mixed with grief, mixed with something that did not have a clean name. The particular emotion of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is being relieved of it in public. She did not cry. She was not built for public crying, and she knew it, and that was fine. But her jaw was tight for a different reason than it had been for most of the past 8 months, and she stood straight and let the moment be what it was. Dr. Hartley spoke after Ardell. She announced the formal launch of the Stonebridge Emergency Trauma Training Program and its partnership with the Special Operations Medical Community. She announced Emily's appointment as director. She said several things about institutional accountability and the obligation of healthcare facilities to the people who served in them, and she said them with the bluntness of someone who had spent 2 weeks reviewing what the previous administration had done and had strong feelings about it. Then she said something that Emily had not expected. Richard Lawson operated in this building for 9 years. He was not invisible. The systems that allowed him to operate, the deference, the silence, the willingness to file things away and not ask what happened to them, those systems belong to all of us. Rebuilding this institution means acknowledging that. She paused. Emily Carter filed 4 compliance reports in 8 months. She raised concerns through the correct channels, and they were buried. The appropriate response to that failure is not to congratulate ourselves on the investigation. It is to make sure it cannot happen again. That starts today. There was a silence after she finished that had a different quality than the one after Ardell. Heavier, more internal, the kind that settled over a crowd when something had been said that was true and uncomfortable and necessary. Emily appreciated it. The honest version of accountability was always harder than the celebratory version, and Hartley had offered both in the same speech, which suggested she was going to be a different kind of administrator than the building was used to. After the formal portion, the crowd dispersed in the gradual way of outdoor gatherings when the structure ends and people move back into their ordinary relationships with each other. Emily spoke to Sandra Briggs and shook Walter's hand, which was stronger than she expected. She spoke briefly to Yunt's wife, who said, "He watched the video from his hospital room. He asked me to tell you something." She handed Emily a folded piece of paper. Emily opened it. She didn't flinch. She just moved. D. Yunt, SFC. Emily folded it back up and put it in her pocket. She spent 20 minutes talking with Torres about protocol exchange, what field medicine looked like in the environments where Ardell's teams operated, what civilian emergency medicine missed, where the gaps were. Torres was precise and unsentimental and had opinions, which made her exactly the kind of person Emily wanted involved in building the program. They exchanged numbers. Reyes shook her hand and said nothing, which was a more complete communication than most things said with words. Cahill said, "The sandwich at this hospital is still bad, for what it's worth." "I'll add it to the list of things to fix," Emily said. He laughed. A real one, full, the kind she suspected he didn't give out frequently. Then he shook her hand and walked away with the particular walk of someone who was going to be fine. Garrett entered a guilty plea 6 days after his arrest. The encrypted communication record had been thorough enough that his attorney had spent less than 48 hours reviewing it before advising him that trial was not a viable option. He received 41 months in federal prison for falsification of government records and conspiracy, with an additional civil judgment that ended his consulting career permanently. Lawson's case took longer. He fought it for 4 months before the weight of the fraud documentation combined with the conspiracy charges and the patient complaints that were continuing to surface made the math of a trial untenable. He pleaded guilty to federal health care fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 14 years, stripped of his administrative credentials and medical license, and required to pay restitution to the Medicare and Medicaid programs he had defrauded. The sum was substantial. The sentence was real. The nurse who had lost her license had it restored 8 months after Rourke's investigation formally connected the documentation used against her to Garrett's template. It took longer than it should have. Restoration usually did. The family of the patient who had died received a civil settlement from Stonebridge's insurer and a formal acknowledgement from the hospital that the complaint had been improperly closed. It was not enough. It never was for that category of loss. But it was documented, and it was public, and it was not nothing. Emily's military record was formally corrected and filed with a commendation addendum that reflected her actual service accurately. She read it once, confirmed it was right, and put it away. Some things you needed to see corrected more than you needed to keep looking at them. The trauma training program launched its first cohort 3 months after Emily's appointment. 12 ER nurses, 4 residents, 2 senior physicians who had signed up voluntarily because the reputation of what was being built had moved through Stonebridge faster than any official communication. Oscar Ruiz was in the cohort, taking a semester of accelerated cross-training alongside his nursing program, moving through the scenarios with the particular focused intensity of someone who was exactly where he wanted to be. The first scenario was a mass casualty simulation. 4 stations, 12 casualties, 15 minutes, no additional resources. Emily ran it without warning, Meb. Just walked in at the start of the shift and said they were going. It was ugly. She expected it to be ugly. You didn't get good at hard things by doing easy versions first. You got good by doing hard versions until the chaos became navigable. She watched 12 people she was responsible for developing struggle through 15 minutes of controlled disaster, and then she sat them down and told them, specifically and without softening it, what had worked and what hadn't, and why. And she watched them listen with the focused discomfort of people who had just discovered the distance between where they were and where they needed to be. That's going to feel like that for a while, she told them. Then it won't. That transition is the whole program. Grace, who had joined the training staff in an advisory capacity because Emily had asked her and she had said yes, caught Emily's eye from across the room and gave her a brief nod that said several things at once, most of them unprintable and all of them supportive. On the afternoon of the program's first cohort graduation, 4 months in, Emily stood in the Stonebridge auditorium and looked at 12 people who were substantially better prepared than they had been when they started. And she thought about the specific nature of what she was doing now versus what she had been doing in the ER 8 months ago. She was still a nurse. She had not stopped being that and did not intend to. But she was also something else now. Something that had not had a name for her until recently, which was a person who built the structures that kept other people capable. The institutional equivalent of what she had done on forward operating bases. Not just providing care in the moment, but building the conditions under which care could be provided reliably, repeatably, by people who might have to do it without her. It was not glamorous. Most of it was curriculum design and scheduling conflicts and budget conversations, and the kind of slow, unglamorous work of building something from the ground up in an institution that was simultaneously trying to run normally and rebuild itself. She was not always patient. She was not always right. She and Hartley disagreed about resource allocation twice in the first 3 months, and one of those disagreements was Emily's fault, and she said so when she understood it, which was not immediately. She was not a perfect person. She had not become one. What she had become was a person who had been tested thoroughly by forces that wanted to diminish her, and who was still standing on the other side of it with a clearer idea of what she was for than she'd had before they tried. Ardell came to the cohort graduation. He sat in the back, in civilian clothes, and did not announce himself, and Emily noticed him anyway because she always noticed Ardell's specific quality of presence in a room. After the ceremony, he found her in the hallway. "Winslow tells me 2 other hospital systems have reached out about replicating the program," he said. "I know. I have meetings next month." He looked at her. "How are you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she did most things. "Better than I was. Still working on some things." That's an honest answer. "You asked an honest question." He nodded. Then he said, "A uniform doesn't make someone capable of this. You know that." "I know." "Character does. The part of you that went back into that trauma bay yesterday morning, and by yesterday I mean the morning 8 months ago when they'd just thrown you out. That part was there before the army, and it was there after, and it was there when nobody was watching, and there was no convoy coming, and no investigation pending." He looked at the hallway, at the stone bridge walls that had been the site of something significant, and were now just walls again, absorbing the ordinary traffic of a hospital doing its work. "That's the part worth keeping." Emily looked at the walls too, at the floor with the repaired crack in the linoleum that maintenance had finally fixed 2 months after she'd noticed it and 6 months after it appeared, at the ceiling lights that no longer buzzed, because Oscar had put in a maintenance request the week after his training cohort started and apparently included it in his incident documentation so prominently that it had finally been addressed. She had been thrown out of this building, had been told, in the clearest institutional language available, that she was not wanted and not valued and not capable. And she was standing in it now as something the building needed, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who were becoming more capable because she was here. She had not arrived at this moment because someone had recognized her potential and given her a chance. She had arrived at it because she had kept doing her job, kept documenting what she saw, kept raising the things that needed to be raised, kept moving when moving was the only thing that made sense, not because she was sure it would work out, but because the alternative was to stop being the person she was, and that had never been an option she was seriously considering. There was something worth knowing in that, she thought, something that didn't resolve neatly into a lesson because real things rarely did. But if she had to name the shape of it, she would say this: the people who tried to make you small were never actually responding to your smallness. They were responding to your size. And the answer to that had never been to shrink. She had not shrunk. She had also not waited to be saved or recognized or vindicated before she kept working. She had kept working because the work was real, and the people in front of her were real, and the skills in her hands were real, and those things existed independent of what Richard Lawson thought of her, or what notation Philip Garrett inserted into a file. That, she thought, was the part worth keeping. She put her badge in her pocket, the new one, with the new title, the one that reflected something true about who she was, and walked back down the hallway toward the ER floor, toward the work that was waiting, toward the day that was still running. And she did not look back at where she had been because she had already seen it clearly, and she knew exactly what it had cost and exactly what it had made. She knew who she was. That had always been enough.